Hello, my name's Chris, what's yours? Welcome back to Marathon Man, where I'm going through Doctor Who from the very beginning, and you join me as we say goodbye to the third Doctor. So, here we are. Watching the show as broadcast means you actually spend years in the company of a Doctor, unless, in the instances of like Paul McGann, Christopher Eccleston, John Hurt and Joe Martin, when their time on screen is fairly limited. But doing a marathon sort of like does truncate that, and depending on your pace, those years that you spend with a Doctor get shortened to you get a matter of months. So even though I only spend a couple of months with one Doctor, I still watch the same amount of show as was stretched over those several years. So I do still sort of feel like I've spent an awful lot of time with them. And so when the time comes to say goodbye, it brings that odd sensation of like oceans of time having passed and yet no time at all. In the blink of an eye and an eternity, they are gone. This goes some way in recreating that sad/excited feeling which goes hand in hand with a Doctor's regeneration, the term actually being coined for the first time here. And so it is with a mix of emotions that I digest Planet of the Spiders. Being one of those stories lent a certain status by being a Doctor's last as the incumbent, it feels rather weighty when sometimes it would do us to remember that even though they do exist to allow for one actor to hand the role over to another, these are still just Doctor Who stories. Yeah, we judge them not only on their own terms, but also as finales to cap off an entire era. And in my opinion, Planet of the Spiders is fine as both. But only fine. The setting up of the regeneration and the themes of renewal and rebirth being seen through it is like an excellent choice, and it gives the whole process much more weight than, say for example with the first and the second Doctors, where it just comes out of nowhere in story terms. Jon Pertwee stepping down is a landmark moment, as it was with Troughton and Hartnell before him. Hartnell, as we know, was pushed and spent a bit of time in the 10th Planet actually incapacitated. And so what that kind of does is, it kind of conspires to be an almost surprise ending, with the Doctor changing, not really being set up at all until those closing moments. And Troughton, who left willingly, was given a slightly better ending. But, even then, the change in appearance comes out of nowhere at the trial. Yes, we at home knew that Patrick Troughton was leaving. We at home know this is the final story for the second Doctor. But from the Doctor's point of view, he's just imposed this forced regeneration. Here though, Pertwee's handover is given due reverence by the story itself, as it actually foreshadows it by having Letts apply his own Buddhism to the Doctor's process of change. And not only does it mean the regeneration is a natural conclusion to the story, as well as being a necessity in terms of cast change, but the very theme of rebirth is remarkably apposite, and in some way it does hark back to the very first regeneration. It's not a million miles away from the second Doctor proclaiming life depends on change and renewal. Except I actually think it's put much more beautifully here by Choji, even though he as a character is a little bit tricky to watch as a 21st century liberal. Now, we've had instances of this type of casting and representation on this marathon before, and we're about to get a few more, one of which I've decided to coincide with a video about this issue. But for now, I think what I'll say is it's worth remembering that such vicious arguments come about from this topic because it's viewed as a clear-cut binary issue, which I don't quite think that it is. Because I think the primary thing here, and certainly in this story, it comes from naivety rather than villainy. But that naivety does come from kind of like a collective arrogance that was around at the time. So despite the show's intentions and the cultural landscape being very different back then, it's, it was still wrong, and it does still leave a bad taste. Look, of course, I'm a Doctor Who fan, and I love it dearly, even when it does some, embarrassing stuff. That cultural landscape has shifted, and the show does a lot better now. Life depends on change and renewal. But while it can and does make for some uncomfortable viewing for me, I treat this issue as separate from the story itself, which I judge on its own terms. And when you consider that Choji is played by the same actor as the one behind Lynx the Sontaran, it makes you realise the range that Kevin Lindsay had. Now, not that I'm saying it's a sensitive portrayal of a Tibetan abbot, but it is a sensitive portrayal of compassion and empathy, which is a far cry from a Sontaran. Now, it's also worth pointing out that while it is not by any means a sensitive portrayal of a Tibetan abbot, the voice and the makeup are obviously quite embarrassing to watch from the 21st century. But Kevin Lindsay wasn't like bashing down the door demanding to play a Tibetan monk. He was hired to play the role. I guess I'll get more into this when I do the video on the topic as a whole, but it's always hard really to blame the actor solely for what is a short-sightedness around at the time from the entire production team. Now, obviously, there'll be people watching this frothing at the mouth and telling me that it shouldn't bother me. It shouldn't bother you. It shouldn't bother you at all. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. It's not fine. And this is what I meant by a collective arrogance. It became like a short-sightedness that they could just hire a white guy and put like makeup on him. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't buy Kevin Lindsay as Tibetan at all. He plays the part he's given quite well. He's not a convincing Tibetan. And therein lies the problem, because as well as it being sort of like quite culturally insensitive, there's always a barrier to it actually being pretty believable. But however we get there, it is nice to have the regeneration front and centre for once. Now, when I said it forms a logical conclusion to the story, that is how it should be. It is wonderful to have the Doctor changing actually be the fitting final act of the story as a whole. It isn't something that just happens to the Doctor at the end. It is a satisfying conclusion to the 6 episodes. It also manages to feel like the wrapping up of an entire era as well, thanks to some callbacks to earlier stories and having Jo send back the Metabilis crystal. That's a nice way of sort of including her in her Doctor's final bow. And the fact that the Metabilis crystal plays a part, and we spend a fair bit of time on Metabilis 3 after the Doctor spent so long gabbing on about going there and taking a brief trip in the Green Death, all of it feels like a rather neat signing off, even if once we get to Metabilis 3, some of the stuff there is a bit naff. We also revisit the idea of the hermit who lived behind the Doctor's house, which was first mentioned way back at the end of season 9. So as well as having this feeling of like tying up all little loose ends or like little bits of things that were mentioned throughout the Third Doctor's era, it also kind of like fleshes out and expands on the Doctor's backstory, mythology of Time Lords. It's a really thoughtful way of doing a handover. It ties off the Third Doctor's era, but it also sort of like leaves the show wide open to carry on. It's really the idea of regeneration and exploring it more than the previous 2 Doctor handovers. It really works. It just feels really suitable in story about one life ending and another beginning, you know, looking back into the past but simultaneously to the future. It's very Buddhist and very Doctor Who. And then Campo turning out to be the hermit is really satisfying in that we don't just sort of like have a callback to him, we actually get to meet him. It's important that we see one of the Doctor's elders in this story, because for the first time it puts the brash, larger-than-life, authoritative Third Doctor in an almost subservient role, deferring to his guru. And this not only shows this Doctor in a new light, even as he's leaving us, but it also lets us know that things are being taken really rather seriously. The Doctor admits that he is at fault, and it being particularly this Doctor, that feels like a huge deal. And yet, even though all of this subtext is nice and everything, I feel like the subtext is the most successful part of the story, because the episodes themselves, they just feel like they drag a little bit for me, particularly at the beginning. It starts really sluggishly, forever going back to that laborious incantation. There are some really nice moments, like the callbacks to the much missed Joe, and Nicholas Courtney does a really wonderful bit of underplayed acting at the beginning when the Brigadier is like greatly impressed by the exotic dancer. But they just feel like really lovely garnishing on a slightly undercooked meal. Speaking of the Brigadier, it feels like he's had some focus slip away from him of late as the show started to favour drifting away from Unit and Earth. So meeting him here again, he's ever so slightly reverted back to the kind of like buffoonish caricature version of himself from the Three Doctors, but more effort is put into humanising him here. And the suggestion of his dalliance with Doris is a lovely touch in that regard. In that, it's not too much, just enough to whet the appetite and get us intrigued by the character again. It's a lovely addition to the script, and even more so because it also works as a gag. Truth be told, I could have done without having Yates back. Yes, he worked well in Invasion of the Dinosaurs, so all the more reason to leave him there. His story just felt finished. Perhaps with the sense of rebirth and whatnot, it was felt that Yates needed his redemption, and while Franklin is actually alright here as well, having him be the opening shot is not a way to get me interested in this story. But on a character level, it is nice to see Yates go some way to redeeming himself. So yeah, I do find this story a bit of a slog towards the beginning, but never fear, here's a chase to help liven things up. Yeah, I sigh every time it grinds into gear, every time it's underway, and every time they change vehicles. I get it, it's Pertwee's last hurrah, so fine, go all out with the excesses, for better or for worse. I just find it leans more towards the worse. I mean, even the composer loses interest at one point. Seriously, at some point the music just stops. And then Lupton just vanishes, and despite a sort of hastily thrown in line from the Spider about getting help from Metebelis 3, that doesn't really stop the feeling from, why didn't they just do that? Like, the whole chase feels pointless. On the subject of Lupton, John Darth is a very good turn. After conjuring up some outstanding work as the voice of Boss in The Green Death, he makes Lupton a very believable character, which goes a long way in grounding the whole thing. His motivations ring true, and the idea of a company man bitter at having given so much of his life to a job he felt overlooked in is as real a motivation for a villain in a Doctor Who story with giant spiders has any right to be. But Darth isn't just given a good character, he contributes a shed load in creating one. When he rants and raves at the fake spider, he sells it phenomenally. He makes me believe that those spiders are alive and real, far more than any puppetry or special effects can. So just as it looks like I'm going to lose patience with Planet of the Spiders and conclude that it's not exactly the grand send-off that Pertwee merits, the man himself seems to confirm my fears and suspicions.
Oh dear, this is getting monotonous.
Hartnell exited, in my opinion, on a damp squib. Troughton left on a high, but it looks like Pertwee is going to follow Hartnell's lead. Except, as the story goes on, in the last 2 episodes to be precise, things really do pick up, and it just feels like it gets a kick up the arse, with a massive upswing in quality. I can't really overlook the flabbiness of earlier on still, but I'm hard pressed to think of a story recently on the marathon where there has been such a drastic change within the duration of the story. Tommy has been a brilliant character throughout, and is a bit dodgy and regressive, to use terms like cured, for him. And before his transformation, thanks to the crystal, the depiction of him is, shall we say, arch. However, it still seems to be done with more sensitivity than the time the programme was made might suggest it would have. For example, it's down to how the other characters handle him which determines that depiction. Now, I could do without the speaking in third person, but the bad guys treat him awfully, making us dislike them instantly, whereas Sarah is lovely in how she handles him. It continues to be a considered and sweet performance when his intelligence is enhanced, and in fact he's such a good character that the story can endanger him and have that warrant a cliffhanger. More often than not, it's the regulars who are imperiled for the sake of a sting, but here, Tommy gets one. His line when Sarah says he's normal,
I sincerely hope not,
is sublime. It throws Sarah's rather unfortunate wording back at her in a really charming way, in that Tommy remains in complete control of the exchange and we don't lose any goodwill towards Sarah either. But it's the last episode in particular which is great, where everything comes together and sends the Doctor on his way. The setting up of the regeneration is done so well, And Pertwee, drawing on that wonderful pathos he can conjure up when telling us about the hermit in his youth or sadly walking away from Josephine Grant, plays it to perfection, even if the effect is a bit pants. I haven't always got on with this Doctor, but it is still sad to see him go. And on a marathon, which is, the most full-on way of watching Doctor Who, when the regenerations come along, they do elicit a response, and that comes with, the whole cocktail of emotions of feeling sad about saying goodbye to one Doctor and the excitement at meeting a new one. And the reason I think this one works quite so well is that Sarah, who hasn't known the Doctor for all that long, is so emotional during the experience. In their short time together, they have built a very real friendship, and through the Doctor accepting her, so have I. She's been played very well by Sladen as well, and has been willing to put herself in danger for the Doctor, even in this story, after being told,
if they catch you, they'll kill you.
She goes to help anyway, without hesitation. She's great, and I, for one, feel the regeneration as much through her as I do watching it myself. So yes, in the end, a fine farewell to the third Doctor. Season 11 started incredibly strongly, and then I would say the wheels fell off in the middle, and that feeling continued, at least for the first half of this story. If I were judging Planet of the Spiders on its second half alone, then the score would be much higher. But as I said earlier on in this video, I can't write off the flabbiness of that first half. And we have to judge these stories on their own terms as well, not just for being big regeneration-y ones. So, after 381 episodes, 11 seasons and 3 Doctors, I am about to begin a new and significant chapter of Doctor Who.
Tear? Sarah Jane? No, don't cry.
I won't play it in its entirety, but the chase. As ever, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this arachnid appraisal, then you know how YouTube works. Please do give it a like and share it around. It really helps the channel no end, and I would be super grateful. And what do you think of this one? Is it a glorious send-off for Jon Pertwee, or is it an overstuffed, self-indulgent hodgepodge of some of this era's worst excesses? Is it sad to say goodbye to him, or are you welcoming Tom with open arms? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you back here soon for a recap of Season 11. So if you don't want to miss that, hit the subscribe button, clang the cloister bell, and I'll see you soon.